on August 26th, and let's call things to order. And shall we begin with the roll call?
Yes, thank you. Chair Tyson.
Here.
Vice Chair Flagger.
Here.
Director Gibbons.
Here.
Thank you. I'll note Director Martinez-Beltran and Director Elahi are absent, but we do have a quorum.
Very good, thank you. Let's proceed with the public comment on items not on the agenda. And of course, I think public knows that they may provide comments on any item not listed on the agenda. And do we have any people who wish to speak? I do not see any hands raised in the public. So with that, I will say thank you very much. We will close public comment and move on to our consent calendar items. We have one item here to approve the minutes of June 24th. Do we have any comments or questions from the participants? I do see a hand raised. Director Gibbons.
If there's no comments, I would make a motion to approve the minutes from our previous meeting.
Very good, thank
Second.
you. And we have a second from Director Flagger. Do we have any comments from the attendees? Seeing none, do we have any comments from the attendees? Seeing none, we will now ask for a roll call vote.
Yes, thank you. Chair Tyson.
Yes.
Vice Chair Flagger.
Yes.
Director Gibbons.
Yes.
Thank you. That motion carries with Director Elahi and Martinez-Beltran absent.
Great, thank you. Let's move on the agenda to the next item, which is item number 2, and that's the CEO update. Thank you. Girish.
Sorry, just one sec. Let me. Yep. Okay, I'm good. So thank you, Chair Tyson. And just a heads up, next month's meeting, the board meeting, a couple of highlight items would be the budget. So the board and several committees have reviewed the budget already. So our goal is to keep it punchy, short. It's more of the synopsis and moving forward. Just want to give you a heads up on that. And then, of course, we'll have our strategic focus areas also. So, and we'll have a closed session related to the CEO evaluation. So we have a couple of other items on extending a few contracts, including one of our PPAs. So that's just a heads up of what's coming up in September. We are reaching the last hours of this year's legislative session, and I'd like to have Benna provide just a brief drive-by overview of where we are. Benna?
Thank you and good morning. So as Girish mentioned, we're at the very tail end of the legislative session. The legislature finishes its work next Wednesday, and we're continuing to work on a couple of top priority bills that we just wanted to give you an update on today. So this includes SB 1158. You might remember this is Senator Becker's 24/7 clean energy reporting bill. Amendments to this bill just came out last night, so we're reviewing those. But I would say that we have had a very positive working relationship with Senator Becker. He's been really wonderful to work with, and we've negotiated some language. So we're double checking that that is in there. Another bill that I know the board is very interested in is AB 2449 by Assemblymember Rubio. You might remember that we took a support position on Assemblymember Alex Lee's bill, AB 1944 on the Brown Act. Unfortunately, that bill is not moving anymore, but AB 2448.
The connection isn't stable.
Remember, Rubio is really the vehicle, which would.
Did everybody get that? Or
is my internet a little bit slow?
No.
Let me turn off my video. I think my internet is a little bit slow. Can you guys hear me now?
Hey, keep going. Let's give it a try.
Okay.
We did miss a couple things you said.
Okay. So AB 2448 would allow our board members to teleconference into meetings, but there are additional rules around that teleconferencing. It includes having a physical quorum present at a location, and then board members would have to disclose the reason why they are teleconferencing, and there are limits on the number of times you can teleconference into the meeting. So I'm working on a more comprehensive description of what is in the bill. This one is on the governor's desk, so we should know whether or not he wants. Finally,
We're missing some of this. Finally, something.
very last minute package of climate related bills that he is pushing. Diablo
Could you
Canyon
start
power
over when
plant.
you,
Sorry.
Benna, could you start over again? You finished 2448, then you said finally, and then you cut out. So could you start at that point?
Okay. Sorry, terrible internet problems this morning. So finally, the governor has a package of bills that he is pushing in the legislature, very last minute bills, but they're related to climate. The chief among these is a 5-year extension of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant to 2030. We think delaying the retirement of Diablo is going to provide some relief for us as we work to bring replacement clean energy projects online. But it is a very last minute bill. Actually, language is not in print yet. We expect some language to come out officially this weekend. And we are working very closely with CalCCA to better understand the bill and its impacts to taxpayers, ratepayers, and shareholders. But we know this is a top priority for the governor. So with that, I will pause here and see if there are any questions.
Thank you for that very nice summary. And let me also add that Director Martinez Beltran and Director Elahi have joined us. So let me ask, are there any, I see one hand up, Director Martinez Beltran.
I just wanted to see if you could repeat that last bill. I was writing my notes and I didn't catch the name.
This is the Diablo extension. Is that the one you're referring to?
Yes.
There is no bill number yet because it's not officially in print. So I don't have one. But again, we're expecting it to come out this weekend at some point.
Thank you.
Great. I don't see any others. The attendees, let me ask a question though. You mentioned AB 2448 about the teleconferencing. Can you tell me, will that require noticing at the physical location of anybody who's not present in person?
No, so the pandemic relief that we have right now where you don't have to notice private locations will still apply.
Okay.
So if you are not going to be physically at the location, you do not have to disclose any private addresses.
Good. You know, this sounds like a very reasonable and practical kind of combination of restrictions. So at least to me, with that, I don't see any other participants. Oops, there's one. Vice Chair Flagger.
Thank you, Chair. And I have 2 questions, and you touched on one of the 2 questions, Chair. Because Ben, I'm trying to understand that Brown Act bill, and George touched on the confusion. So we would still have to do the public notice, for example, saying, I will be participating remotely from my home. Does it address whether or not we could still prohibit council meetings or board meeting attendees from coming into our homes? Because I think that was part of the old Brown Act or the current Brown Act, where not only are you required to publicly notice where you're located, but you have to essentially open your doors if they're individuals who want to attend from your location. Does this bill address that? Because that's concerning. Can you talk about that portion, please? And then the
Sure,
follow-up
of
question,
course.
Benna, it's the other bill that I think it's the Cortese bill, the bill that's moving forward about giving the chair or the person managing the meetings of the mayor the ability to take steps if someone is being continuously disruptive.
Great question. So on your first question, yes, both the requirement to post your private location and allow the public to access that location would be removed under AB 2449. So you would not have to do either of those 2 things as long as you fulfill the other requirements in the bill, like noticing the reason why you're teleconferencing, et cetera. And then on your other question, SB 1110 by Senator Cortese about disorderly conduct was actually signed by the governor. So that was another bill that we supported.
Great. Thank you for those answers. And now let's move on to, I see a hand up for the attendees. So can we please promote Mr. Bruce Carney?
Thank you very much. Yesterday or the day before, I received a 5-page analysis of the extension to Diablo Canyon written by an environmental activist who lives in San Luis Obispo, very near Diablo Canyon. I forwarded that to Monica, seeking her feedback on it, and also asking if SVCE had taken a position on the extension of Diablo Canyon. She forwarded that to Benna, and both of them let me know that SVCE does not have a position. And realizing that, in the next 5 days there won't be a board meeting, so you can't take an official position. I would like to say, though, that I'm very concerned that the governor's interest is largely motivated by his desire to run for president and his desire to make sure that there's not another significant electric power outage in California between now and that time. The analyst, Eric Vyam, made it fairly clear that the resource adequacy standards keep getting ramped up in a way that I personally believe has more to do with political ambition than the ability to sustain the grid. He also points out that the public safety power shutoffs affect far more people for far longer than rolling blackouts would do. So venting just a little bit here and perhaps asking for your thoughts. I don't think that the extension of Diablo Canyon's license is in the best interest of Californians, particularly ratepayers, since that extension is likely to produce very expensive electricity, part of the baseline or baseload electricity, which means we'll all be paying for it all the time until the shutdown finally takes place. Additionally, there are staffing issues because the current staff of Diablo Canyon, we're all expecting to retire in the next 2 or 3 years. And colleges and universities are not graduating scores of young nuclear engineers or technicians to take their place. So thank you for the opportunity to vent about this issue. And if you have other opinions, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you for those comments. Bruce, I'm going to leave it up to you, CEO Balachandran, if you wish to reply. But certainly, I think we heard his concerns.
Yeah, obviously this is last minute, so we really don't have time to get into the details. But CalCCA has done analysis around it. We are short of 1,600 megawatts in 2025-26 period, which is what the CEC and CPUC has come up with too. So I haven't actually seen this letter yet and reviewed it, but I think there are hearings that are being undertaken at the Senate level, and right as we speak, the Assembly is having a hearing on it. I believe there's been input from the CAISO and PUC on the need for this. It's being driven by the governor's office, and we're right at the last minute over here. So I think there's an interest in terms of making sure the safety interests need to be addressed, ratepayer interests, taxpayer interests, and reliability in keeping the lights on. So I'm not sure I agree with the public comment about this being a politically motivated initiative. In fact, I disagree with that. There may be some of it, but reliability is definitely an issue. We've had a blackout. Prices in California are at a record high when it comes to market prices. So having more capacity, especially clean capacity in the system, whether it's this unit or more batteries and solar, we need that, and we need that in the next 3 years to keep the lights on and reduce emissions. So it's not as simple as what the public comment has mentioned. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, CEO Balachandran. And I think that was a very, I think that was a comprehensive response, and I appreciate that. With that, I realize this item is here for discussion. Was there more in the CEO report? And were you done, Benna? I'm sorry, if you had more to report.
Yes. No, I was done. Thank you.
Oh, okay, very good. All right.
And I'm done, Chair.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for enlightening us on those issues. And with that, we'll move on to item number 3, Inflation Reduction Act This is also for discussion.
Yes, thank you. So I will keep my camera off just in case my internet issues keep popping up, and please just interrupt me if you can't hear me. But thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. Next slide. Super excited about this act and the potential that it will have to really help us meet our climate change mitigation goals. This is the largest single federal investment in clean energy, and it's really a carrot approach to decarbonizing the economy, which is very exciting. From our perspective at SVCE, there's two major benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act. First, around clean energy, a lot of the provisions around extending and expanding both the production tax credit and investment tax credit for new renewable energy projects will help spur that industry. Very excitingly for us as well, the standalone storage for the first time also qualifies for an investment tax credit. And tax exempt entities like CCAs can now access those tax credits directly. So this is a game changer, an additional tool in the toolbox for how we might want to finance projects. On the program side, the Inflation Reduction Act really supercharges building and transportation electrification efforts that we are undertaking here locally. And the bill does that through consumer rebates and tax credits. Next slide. So this is one of my favorite graphs that are some modeling that's happening right now to show the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act. So you'll see here that red line and that red dot is where our current policy and status quo will get us in terms of emissions reductions. And you'll see that purple line is really what happens with the Inflation Reduction Act. So you see this massive reduction in emissions just from the Inflation Reduction Act. I'll mention here too, the blue line here is the net zero pathway. So this is where we want to go. And you'll see there's still a gap between the purple line with the Inflation Reduction Act and a net zero. So we have plenty of work to do, but this really gives us a fighting chance to achieve our climate change mitigation goals. Next slide. So just very quickly wanted to cover a couple of the highlights of the package here. Again, as I mentioned, really the key cornerstone is the clean energy tax credits. So these production tax credits and investment tax credits for renewable projects. I will mention as well that there are bonus tax credits for projects that use prevailing wage, have domestic parts and materials, and for those that are located in brownfield or former coal and gas kind of communities. Also very interesting is that these tax credits are technology neutral after 2024. So they really will help adapt to any new technologies that come onto the market. And these tax credits will be stable for over 10 years. And that stability really provides some certainty to the market and certainty for investors that we think is very positive. You'll see that in addition to the domestic requirements, the bill also invests in making sure that there is domestic manufacturing. So this includes $60 billion for manufacturing solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, et cetera, and additional money for clean tech manufacturing facilities. Next slide. Another key portion of this bill is around the EV investments. So you might remember that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that Congress passed last year really contained a lot of the EV charging station investments. So this new package in the IRA focuses on the consumer side, so how people purchase new and used electric vehicles. So there are additional tax credits that will become point of sale rebates at a dealership for up to $7,500 for new vehicles. And then for the first time, we'll also cover used vehicles as well. Both of these tax credits are also dependent on domestic battery and critical mineral content. New for these tax credits and point of sale rebates are income limits. So people who make $150,000 or below can qualify. And there's also limits on the sale price of vehicles. So it's $55,000 for most vehicles and then an $80,000 sale price for vans, trucks, and SUVs. Interestingly, this tax credit also applies to commercial. So any fleet kind of purchases can access these tax credits as well. And then again, you get bonus tax credits for domestic content, and the bill also invests money in boosting our domestic capacity for manufacturing EVs here. Next slide. Very excited that this package includes a very comprehensive suite of building decarb investments as well. Many of these are in the form of rebates. Some of these programs, like the high efficiency electric home rebate program, is really geared towards middle and low income families. It has direct grants, or I'm sorry, will be grants to states to do direct rebates for heat pump cooling and heating systems, heat pump water heaters, electric panel upgrades, and electric wiring. So it's a pretty comprehensive package. There's also the homes rebate program, which is grants to states for $2,000 to $4,000 rebates to consumers, depending on the energy savings that you can get from the package of improvements you're making to your home. And these also apply to multifamily dwellings as well. We're also very excited to see that the package makes some investments in things that we have been working on, including contractor training grants. So you'll remember we have an online contractor training program that's been very successful. There'll now be national money to do some of this work as well. And then there is also $1 billion set aside for grants to states and local governments to adopt building codes. So a lot of that REACH code activity that we're doing locally, there'll also be national programs for. Next slide. Wanted to highlight very quickly that there are also community funds that are coming. A lot of these funds are dedicated for low income and disadvantaged communities. These include block grants to nonprofits that partner with local governments. It also has funds to low income and disadvantaged communities for climate pollution reduction grants, as well as $50 million for air pollution in schools. So again, grants for schools to monitor and reduce air pollution in low income and disadvantaged communities. Next slide. There are additional investments in this package. There's probably too many to list in the presentation, but some highlights here. There's federal clean energy procurement funding, including $3 billion for the Postal Service to purchase EVs. There's Green Bank funding, which is really for a clean energy technology accelerator to support deployment of technology in disadvantaged communities. And then you'll remember the president signed an executive order recently that authorized the Defense Production Act for the production of domestic heat pumps and solar. And this bill now has funding to back that up of $500 million, which is really exciting. Next slide. Finally, you'll see that there are some policies in here, including methane's emissions reductions program. This is the stick. There's a very few sticks in this bill. This is one of them. There's a fee on excess methane emissions, but it's also paired with some grants for the industry to monitor and reduce methane. So there's a little bit of carrot here as well. And then you'll see that this bill reflects Senator Manchin's all of the above strategy. So one key piece is that it requires oil and gas lease sales each year before any utility scale renewable projects on public lands or waters. This includes offshore wind. So the idea is that you'd have to at least offer the land for oil and gas purposes if you want to do that for clean energy purposes as well. Next slide. So, super exciting to be working on this package from SVCE's perspective, really see a need to maximize the Inflation Reduction Act's potential. I think this is a chance to prove that federal investments will make a difference and that we're worthy of additional investments in this space. And we have a lot of work to do to advocate and adapt our programs and really look for complementary policies and funding. Again, going back to that first graph, we still have a gap between what the Inflation Reduction Act is modeled to do and where we want to go. So there's a lot of work and we want to make sure that these local and state programs are complementary. So actions that we've done in the past, we've signed on to a joint CCA letter. We've done a couple of these, but we did one most recently just on the Inflation Reduction Act. To leaders Schumer and Pelosi, and then we also sent that letter to our House delegation before the vote was taken. And now we're really in the phase of analyzing all the impacts and how we want to adapt our work here at SVCE. So that includes forming some internal teams to understand the opportunities in the IRA And in the building decarb space, it's really to conduct some gap analysis on what populations are served in these new programs in the IRA, where some gaps might exist, either in the percentage of funding or the project costs that are covered or the people that will be reached. And we'll use that to inform SVCE's programs development and also that regional and state advocacy that I was mentioning. We really also see this as an opportunity to share SVCE's best practices. Some of the interesting things we've been doing, for example, around online contractor training, are there lessons learned that could be applied at the national level? On the clean energy tax credits, we're working now to understand the investment tax credits and production tax credits and the impact to existing and future PPAs. And then we're also working very collaboratively with other CCAs to both identify opportunities related to asset ownership and some of the new authority that we can access through direct pay of these tax credits. And then also working collaboratively in the building and EV space to understand how we can access the funding and again, advocate for complementary policies. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Benna, for a very comprehensive and quite exciting kind of presentation. Last time I saw something like this, I was excited about the postal vehicle zero emissions, and this time I'm going to switch gears and say I really like this methane tax. I notice it's roughly 20 times what a CO2 tax has been, which is roughly the impact on the environment. So that's surprisingly thoughtful for legislators. So let me go ahead with questions, and we have a hand up from Director Gibbons.
Thank you. Really very comprehensive, but also understandable presentation. Thank you, Benna. Two quick questions, I think. And that your very last slide spoke to this. When you talk about tax credits and they're being accessible to nonprofits like CCAs, does that mean, do you think at this point, do you think that means that we can sell our tax credits as a negotiation tool with some developers? Is that what that means? Otherwise, how might we use tax credits?
So maybe I can take a first shot at this, but I know Amrit is here as well, and he is definitely more of an expert in this space. So my understanding of how direct pay works is that in the past, because we are a tax exempt entity, we don't get those tax benefits directly because we don't file a tax return, for example. But these new changes in the Inflation Reduction Act allow us to access that money. So we would file a tax return and get the value of that investment tax credit, for example, directly paid to us. Instead, right now, I think through the PPA structure, we have to partner with a third party, and the developer kind of gets access to those tax credits. But with that, I will stop, and Amr, please jump in and correct me if I was wrong.
That's correct, Benna. That's our understanding at this point. I think we're looking for more rules from the IRS to come up on technical implementation, but what we're reading so far indicates what Benna said is we would be able to file a return and get actually the credit for it, even though we have no taxable income.
Interesting.
So it'd be like a refund.
Yeah, it's like a refund. Interesting. I didn't realize until just now that we do in fact negotiate with developers on our current tax credits. If I understood what Benna just said.
Yeah, so right now they have taxable income, or they partner with another entity that has taxable income that they partner with, and through access to those tax credits, they indirectly float a lower price to us.
And we've been doing that with our development along.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah. I did not realize that. Great. And thank you. And the second question is, there's some challenges with the IRA that talks about some of it goes into effect now and some of it goes into effect in January. Is there anything in particular that we need to pay attention to for our programs or something?
Yeah, so that's part of our analysis because each of these programs have different effective dates. Many of them, like Amrit mentioned, we're waiting for guidance from the IRS or from other federal agencies about how they want to roll out those funds. There are also many funds in the building decarb space, for example, that will be flowing to states, and then states will have the opportunity to add additional guidelines or rules on how that money is spent. So we're anticipating for those kinds of programs, probably at least another year of implementation before those are rolled out to families and to consumers.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for those questions and answers. And frankly, Director Gibbons, your first question was my question. My only other thing was an observation is, doesn't the world have enough IRA acronyms already? Couldn't they have come up with another name? With that, I don't see any other hands raised, and so let's go to the attendees, and I see Mr. Carney's hand up. And he's already with us on this side.
So thank you. I also had a question about the timing of the availability of the various incentives. I'll start again in case I just saw the 3-minute warning. I also have a question about the timing of the availability of the various incentives, because of course there's a lot of excitement in the decarbonization community, people wanting to get started and realizing that we now have a bottleneck in terms of contractors who are trained and capable of doing the kinds of decarb things that we would like to see happen. And so I think as part of the outreach from SVCE to its customers, it's really important to be as comprehensive as possible, as soon as possible, about when incentives will be available, if they are available now, feature that. And also so that we don't get in the situation of somebody installing, batteries or a new service panel and discovering that they did it too soon to be to get the incentives. I'm also wondering whether direct solar water heating is orphaned out of this. I know that in the past, the tax credits for solar water heating have been pretty generous, but I didn't hear you mention that technology. And I guess the other thing is that it seems to me really important that SVCE accelerate its contractor training to the max to try to make sure that that bottleneck of people capable of performing these actions is as small a bottleneck, or sorry, as insignificant a bottleneck as possible. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. I don't know if staff would like to address that middle question about the direct solar water heating and the status. If anybody knows the answer to that.
I will have to double check on that. I don't remember it being one of the technologies that's called out, but I will double check. I appreciate the question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Carney, and also for your comments about the timing of the incentives, and then also the accelerate the contractor training. I think we heard you there. With that, this is for discussion, and I think we've had a good discussion, and I'm ready to move on now to item number 4 as a strategic focus area update, which is also for discussion.
Thank you, Chair Tyson. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a moment while I find the right window. Okay. So there are no changes to the mission and measure. Here's a timeline of what we have brought to the board and committees. You'll notice that the strategic plan and budget kind of work together. In some cases, there's been a budget presentation where Amrit would have mentioned the strategic plan. Strategic plan tends to look out a little longer. Then, of course, the budget is an operational document that we hope that the priorities that the board has set through this process get reflected in the budget. So you'll see these two kind of being intertwined. So today we are going to talk about strategic focus areas, and the action item on September 14th would be both budget approval and adoption of the strategic focus areas. And on October 12th, we'll present to you for information our work plan. And that's a lot of detail. And currently our work plan has 21 goals and 75 measures. So it's about a 12-page document. Impossible to really have a good discussion with the board with such a long document. So we'll get to that in some follow-up slides. So this is just a schematic. On the left-hand side is a picture of that document I was telling you about. We have the mission, we have goals, measures, and we have something called focus areas. It's just a thing that we've come up with in the last few years to help us navigate our strategic planning process. No change to the mission. The goals and measures, we've undertaken some discussion in previous committees and the budget discussion. The document is being updated. We are also changing the focus as I presented to you at the last month to have a customer-focused framework, and we'll present that to the board in October. On the strategic focus areas, we have discussed 5 focus areas at previous meetings with the board. To note that we started this as an internal process. We talked to our staff we had a retreat end of April looking at what it is we should be working on. And then we distilled focus areas out of that. We've updated it through committee work and through work with the board. There have been some changes to the focus areas since I last presented it to you, and it has to do with the Inflation Reduction Act. But before I get there, just a little primer on what these focus areas are. Limiting it to 5. Why 5? Why not 3? Why not 7? No, just 5, whatever. I can change it if we want to. 5 sounds like a good number, manageable. They are spotlight, cross-cutting incremental priorities. They do not replace our work plan and goals. Our work plan and goals are being developed. I think it's super useful for the conversation between the board and CEO, especially in meetings like this, to establish priorities. It basically captures, it's like trying to use the 80-20 rule. You get like 80% of the value of prioritization through something like this without it taking too much time and effort for all 13 of our board members. And then going one level deeper, once we have this discussion, it really helps us to prioritize and drive the detailed work plan development. And as I mentioned, the work plan has 21 goals, 75 measures. So there are lots of tactics, et cetera, in that. That's a lot in there. So what are the changes that we've made since we last presented it to you? So we last presented 5 strategic focus areas. 2 of those focus areas in the past dealt with employees. One was to hire more employees, and the second one was a cultural thing. It's like making sure we have a high-performing team and preserving that startup innovative culture. So I've combined those 2 focus areas into one. So not really eliminated it, I just combined it into one and added a new one for the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is what it looks like right now. On the top, I've just labeled, these are the 5 areas of our focus areas. There's one on 24/7 clean energy. There's one on our customer base and electrification. The new one is on the Inflation Reduction Act. There's one on finance and one on employees. So I'm now going to show you kind of like a definition of what that is. And here's what it looks like. There's a lot of words in here, but if I could go from left to right and say that everything in that is titled blue, we've talked about, but I'm going to go over it again. 24/7 clean energy was exploring 24/7 clean energy delivery at scale to improve on the current 100% clean energy goal. Today, our 100% clean energy goal is an annual balancing of clean energy, and exploring and there's a key point here, it's exploring. We are not committing yet, and Chair Tyson, I do remember your comments from that meeting that we're committing to exploring it. Now, note that we have a contract with Google on 24/7, and Google is one of our larger customers. And that's why we are talking about exploring it at scale. So we've already prototyped a 24/7 kind of product, but let's look at it at scale. The second one is our customer base and electrification. We want to add electrification as to expand our efforts on electrification as part of our value proposition. You know, we've talked about our value proposition being 100% clean energy at a competitive rate. And now we're talking about, let's emphasize electrification more. This has kind of been in process by us talking about our future fit home programs, et cetera, but we want to raise it up and kind of make it explicit at the board level that electrification would be an added part of our value proposition. The growing customer base is associated with direct access customers and retaining and trying to get more direct access customers into our customer base. The next is the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not really going to spend time on that since Benna already talked about it and the next steps there. Finance was around leveraging our balance sheet for structured financing. That's one part of it, which gets to things like prepay. We've done one prepay program already, one prepay deal, but we have capacity to do 5x to 8x more volume on prepays. So that's something we're looking at. We're also looking at an option just in the last month or so about the ability to extend prepaid deals to our large C&I customers, which also gets to attracting some DA customers in. So that's why also this arrow on the top says there's synergy and overlap between these focus areas. The second part of the finance focus area is to use financing solutions to increase the impact of decarbonization program offerings, especially to lower income customers. So this becomes, you know, whether it's tariff on bill financing or low income programs. And I think both the California state budget has a climate package, and then of course the IRA has dollars. All this is going to get a lot more clear to us in the next couple of months. And so this is another focus area for us, is the use of financing as a tool to accelerate and expand our decarbonization program offerings. The last focus area is on the employee side, and there are two pieces to it. One is being the employer of choice, which has to do with the culture and innovation and making SVC an amazing place to work in. And then, of course, it's the actual bandwidth that we have, which gets to one of the public comments made too. I think all our staff is maybe just as excited about the opportunities that we have right now. It's almost like the afterburners or the V8 engine kind of strapped onto our mission statement. It's amazing. It's like we want to make sure, and even though there's a lot of money coming in now, we still are in a marathon. When you think about the amount of infrastructure that has to be replaced in terms in homes and businesses and on the roads to make sure that this transition accelerates and expands. So increasing staffing, increasing what we're calling our process intelligence. It's not just the human bandwidth, but also our process intelligence. That's all part of the employee side. My next 5 slides basically go into detail on this, but I'd rather stop here for a second because there are lots more words coming up in the next 5 slides on the detail, and be happy to go to each one of those. But I'd like to stop right now and just see if there's any reaction from the board at this, from the executive committee at this point.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. And I'll make a couple of comments while others can gather their thoughts, because my impression is the magnitude and the breadth of this Inflation Reduction Act is it makes sense to me that you've made it one of your 5 and combine the 2 employee focuses. I also just have to say, in terms of a board presentation and strategy and kind of level of detail, this slide resonates for me as being something that really makes things clear. And you know, Inflation and Reduction Act is one area. I think we also have to be alert to other things going on. You sort of brushed against it with the state just providing their new transportation goals. And I'm sitting here thinking, okay, that doesn't rise to a level of one of these 5, but it seems as though that might have a biggest impact on our customer base and electrification in terms of charging facilities. Would you go along with that?
Yes, and this is where there's a little bit of art to it, Chair. it's definitely part of our work plan. It definitely is all about synergy and making sure we are leveraging as many resources. So answer is yes.
Okay, so now let me ask if there are any of the panelists that have a comment or question they'd like to offer up. I think our CEO has offered that he's got more slides, but I think he's saying you could stop now or go into more detail. I think that was the question. So if you have
and I'd be
an opinion
yes. Yeah, thank you.
I'd be interested to hear anybody's opinion on that. I see Director Gibbons. Please go ahead.
I like, as you said earlier, Chair, I liked the structure of the presentation and the level of detail of the presentation. It's comprehensible, but you can just, it's easy for our board and the public to understand what we're talking about here. So I thought that was very well done. I would suggest that the comment regarding the state's new rules might come a little bit of an extra sentence under customer base and electrification. I think that might connect how that focus area a little bit. And other than that, I think it's right where we want to be. So thank you.
Okay, so we've heard her weigh in that this is, I think that means she doesn't need the next 5 slides. And I would tend to agree with that, but are there any other opinions? I don't see any. Let me ask the attendees if there are any opinions or any feedback.
I do have one more slide, the 6th slide. So I'll skip through 5. You'll see it at high speed. And I will move those slides to the appendix when I present it to the board.
Great.
But I do have a next step slide, which is
all right. So go through the slides, and when you say high speed, maybe 5 seconds on each. Okay,
perfect.
Not 1 second.
Okay, no problem. You tell me, and I'll click the button.
Well, I'm a fast reader, though. Okay. All right, I'm good. Okay, this is where you might add that detail about the state thing. Okay.
Done. I think over here, I think Benna mentioned it, but I'll also mention that the 4th bullet, assist member agencies in evaluating this. Benna has made a presentation to the MOG yesterday, and it'll be a standalone item at the September MOG meeting. So your member staff will be.
Okay, good. But I'm not remembering what the SVCE framework is.
That's the Socioeconomic Vulnerability Index. It's a way in which we stratify our customer base by census tract on the top quartile and into 4 quartiles. And so our program equity framework focuses on using this so that we can, maybe increase program offerings to those who are at one end of the spectrum on the SVCE index.
Okay, I'm going to say if once spelled out, it's almost self-explanatory, and I would put a little asterisk and in tiny letters below.
Got it.
Okay. Okay, I think that hits the high points.
I'll note here, and maybe verbally also when I talk about the summary, that the 3rd bullet here of developing plans for remote, hybrid, and in-person work. And if I wouldn't mind, I'll just call out one more issue. I'm going to go back 2 slides, Chair.
Okay.
The last bullet here is to evaluate policies related to utilization of organized labor and utility scale projects and decarb programs and present some options to the board. So that'll be part of the work plan for this coming year.
Good. I think you're touching on things that I've heard board members express. So I think that sounds good.
Okay, I'll mention that verbally. And it'll be in the appendix. I'll call it out also. So if someone wants to. Okay, so this is my last slide. Essentially the yellow thing, that's the next area. I'll make it a shorter presentation. We'll ask for an adoption of the focus areas, and it'll roll into the budget too, which will be the main item. another item. Thank you.
Good, good. I expect that would go smoothly. Director Gibbons, is your hand up a new time? Yes, please go ahead.
So just a quick comment. If I recall, there was one slide from when we did the SEVI presentation that kind of summarized it. You might also put that in the appendix so people can see how it divvied out.
Done.
Good idea. I don't see any other directors, but I do see a member of the public's hand up. And so please go ahead, Mr. Carney.
Thank you very much. On slide 15, which was one of the ones that Girish zoomed by, I believe I read something about using reserves to advance the organization's mission, which I think is a very interesting idea, both for SVCE and also for the constituent cities to consider allocating some of their reserve funds toward loans or other financial vehicles that might accelerate the transition to a decarbonized economy, and perhaps even increase the average rate of return on the reserve portfolio. And I'm not aware of the laws regarding the prudent use of entity reserves. I'm sure Mr. Singh can talk about that. But I also have a risk question that I'd love to hear from the CEO or the CFO about, which is I don't understand the reconciliation mechanism that allowed Congress to pass the IRA with only 50%, or sorry, 50 senators plus one. I know that typically, thanks to the filibuster, you need 60 senators to sign on to anything. And so I'm concerned about what is the risk that if the Republicans take both houses or even just one house of Congress in the coming election, that this can be undone. And would that leave SVCE or other entities, including private individuals who are depending on tax credits, hung out to dry as the tide that's now washing in recedes? So if anybody could provide some thoughts about that, either today or at the board meeting, I would certainly appreciate understanding where the risks lie to the entire IRA structure. Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you. Yes.
We'd be happy to address that at the next board meeting.
That's what I would suggest. I would suggest that. And that issue on use of reserves, it's funny, I didn't read it the same way as Mr. Carney. I didn't read it as a potential for us to loan money. I used it as make sure that we stay solvent and stay in business and further our mission because we have those reserves. So that's how I read it. So we'll just take both of those comments and with thanks. And I think I don't see any other comments. And so with that, I'm ready to move on to item number 5, which is the Integrated Resource Plan Status Update, which is also for discussion.
All right, great. I will just share my screen quickly. Are you all able to see that?
Yes, we can.
All right, perfect. So good morning, everybody. I'm Maren Wenzel. I'm the Senior Manager of Regulatory and Policy Analysis here. So I wanted to speak to you all a little bit today about integrated resource planning. So first, I'm going to give some background on the proceeding itself, and then I'll share with you where we are in updating the SVCE 2022 IRP. So first, just a sort of high level of what the IRP is all about. So the CPUC uses the integrated resource planning proceeding as an umbrella proceeding. So it's the place where the CPUC takes all of the various state goals and policy issues and tries to create a unified plan to see what resources we need on the grid in order to meet all of our goals. So this is the third IRP cycle. And at a high level, the way it works is that every 2 years, LSEs submit their individual IRPs. And in doing that, what we will all submit is one or more portfolios that show how we're able to meet our resource adequacy and clean energy goals. And over time, the metrics in the IRP have changed a bit. So we started back in 2018 with a 46 million metric ton GHG target for the entire state. And we're now looking at 38 and 30 million metric ton targets. This is also the first IRP where there's really specific resource adequacy obligations. So in the past, we were asked to speak to how our portfolio assisted with resource adequacy, but as a result of all the reliability concerns that we've talked about today and in the past, we are now required to calculate and prove that we have sufficient resources in our portfolio to meet the CPUC's view of what the system will need. So once all of the LSEs file these plans, the CPUC will take them all and stitch them together to create what they call a preferred system plan. They then model that preferred system plan to check that the aggregate meets all of our state goals. And if it fails to do so, they might order additional procurement, which is what they've done in the previous 2 cycles. And so that's one of the reasons why the IRP is so impactful, is because it's the place where the CPUC orders a lot of procurement. And so we've seen almost 15 gigawatts ordered in the last 2 cycles. One quick note, when I talk about the policy goals that the state's trying to achieve here, it's things like reliability, the renewable integration, the distributed energy resource integration, and the electrification goals. So a lot of the same topics we spoke about during our workshop presentation a couple months back.
Pardon me, do you mind adding the NQC to your acronyms chart?
Yes, I will do that. It's not there.
Okay.
Thanks for calling that out. So backing up a little bit, California obviously has some pretty ambitious climate goals. And so the IRP is really the means for us to achieve those in the electricity sector. But as a state, we are trying to get to 80% below 1990 levels by 2050 at a minimum. And so the IRP checks to make sure we're on track for our SB 100 targets, which is to achieve 100% of retail electricity sales coming from renewable and carbon-free energy by 2045. So the targets I spoke about, the 38 MMT and 30 million metric ton targets for 2030 come from CARB, the California Air Resources Board. And they set that number back in 2017 when they said that by 2030, they think we need something like 30 to 50 million metric tons of emissions in the electricity sector at the most in order to achieve our 2050 goals. So as I mentioned before, we started at 46 metric tons. We're now starting to push towards the 30 metric ton target, but it's all within CARB's original range. Obviously, SVCE has much more ambitious goals, and we are trying to decarbonize not just the electricity sector, but also transportation, natural gas, buildings. The IRP does think a little bit about those other sectors, but I will say it is very much the electricity sector specific. So I mentioned previously that at the end of each cycle, the CPUC puts together a preferred system plan, but they also start each cycle with what they call a reference system plan. And for 2022, the reference system plan is essentially last cycle's preferred system plan with a couple changes to inputs and assumptions. But the big takeaway here is that the CPUC believes that we need something between 34 and 46 gigawatts of new capacity on the system by 2030 in order to achieve our GHG targets. And you'll see here that the majority of this capacity comes from batteries, which is shown in the purple in these bars, solar, which is that dark yellow, and then quite a bit of wind. And so the wind shows up in those blue shades, and it comes in sort of 3 different resource categories: in-state wind, new out-of-state wind, and then additionally, they now are showing a need for offshore wind. So for our 2022 filing, we have a number of deliverables. First of all, it's going to be due November 1st. And there are 3 deliverables that we'll have to provide to the CPUC. First of all, we provide a narrative document, and that discusses our modeling exercise, how we developed our portfolios, and also asks for us to discuss some key planning issues, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Then for each portfolio we file, we will have a resource data template, which shows all of the contracts we have and everything we would expect to have in that portfolio. And then a clean system power tool, which is really the GHG calculator associated with that portfolio. I've been mentioning throughout this presentation that we are looking at 38 million metric ton and 30 million metric ton targets, but this time around, the CPUC has actually said that if we would like to, we can show portfolios that just exceed the 30 million metric ton target. And so that's currently what SVCE is looking into. That could change, but our current trajectory is to only file portfolios that exceed the 30 million metric ton target. And it's, of course, our share of that target. As far as where we are right now, there are portions of the narrative that we can write without having our portfolios fully developed. So we are trying to get as much of that done as we can in advance. And then in the portfolio development portion of our exercise, we're currently doing all of our capacity expansion modeling. I'll show you the results of that in just a moment. One last thing about the IRP sort of background before we jump into our portfolios or what we're thinking about for our portfolios is just to say that the IRP is a compliance obligation at the end of the day, and the CPUC does dictate some very specific inputs and assumptions to us. So one of the big ones is that they tell us what load forecast we're supposed to use. And obviously that input impacts our RA requirements, our RPS requirements, and everything else. So the forecast we're given is based on the CEC's IPER. And it does not necessarily match SVCE's internal views. It's not necessarily going to reflect those electrification goals that Girish was just talking about. But nonetheless, it's what we're going to be using for this cycle. I will note that there is a high electrification scenario that we're going to be looking at. But once again, that's also a very specific forecast that comes from the CEC. So with that, I might pause for just a moment to see if there's any questions sort of on the proceeding itself.
See if there's any questions while we wait for that. Do you mind going to slide 7? Because I had a question, and it talked about the portfolio, and I see battery as that purple piece, but battery is not actually a source. Does that mean that we really should be sourcing solar, wind, geothermal more than those other colored bars to provide the energy for the purple?
Yeah, so the model that they use, the Resolve capacity expansion tool, it does check to make sure there's sufficient energy. So a lot of that solar that you're seeing built is being used to charge those batteries. So in this scenario, the model does believe it's getting enough energy from all of the new resource sources and the resources on the grid. So hopefully that helps a bit.
Okay, I think so. I'm not sure. But go ahead. Let's see if I don't see any other hands raised. So I'm going to say I think it's fine to go ahead and continue with your presentation.
All right. Oh, I see. Chair
Oops, I just see one. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. So to your question, Chair, I think what I understand is when we're doing our RFPs and things and contracting for new power, it includes the batteries and the fact that there's an opportunity with the whatever system it is to fill the batteries. But I think recently we had a conversation about charging batteries from the grid. So I think some of that all comes in a, I'm just going to say, a circular manner.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
that's useful context. And so everything I was showing before is, the system-wide look. In just a moment, I'll show you what we need, what our modeling results, at least so far, are showing we'll need for our own portfolio. And that's intended to hit our internal energy targets to make sure that we're staying at 100% clean. So I'll hopefully be able to speak more specifically to our portfolio in just a moment.
And before you proceed, I'm just thinking about Director Gibbons' comment. If we did charge from the grid, the scenario for that would be because we had excess green energy. And so I would think that it would tend to fit under the umbrella of what we're trying to accomplish. I think that's the only scenario where there's so much excess energy at such a low price. So I'm just thinking out loud. So with that, please go ahead.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so before I jump into the exact portfolios that we're modeling right now, I wanted to provide a little bit of context for how we think about developing portfolios. And so I think for any portfolio we put forward, we want to make sure that we're hitting on what I sort of think of as the big 3 in system planning, which is, the portfolio needs to balance reliable, clean, and affordable. But because this is a compliance exercise, we also need to make sure that any of the portfolios we put forward are meeting all of the input assumptions that we're required to for these conforming portfolios. And then in addition to being affordable, clean, and reliable, we need to make sure that the portfolios balance, financial and regulatory risks in a meaningful way. Before jumping ahead, I wanted to sort of very briefly touch on this clean issue. As we were talking about in the last section, I think we are certainly trying to explore at scale this 24/7 strategic goal. And so that's going to be part of our IRP exercise this time around. And I'll discuss a little bit more about how we're going to do that in a minute. But I also want to just mention that I think it's very important that any portfolio we put out there is a viable path to getting to clean energy. So we don't want to say that we're going to be able to achieve goals that really would require amount of build that is just not practical to get done in the near term. So with that, we're currently looking at 3 different potential conforming plans to file. So we have a 75% RPS by 2030 case, 100% RPS by 2030, and 100% RPS by 2035. And I will show you the draft results of those in just a moment.
Is that a typo you've got there in terms of those dates?
So the planning horizon goes out to 2035. So
you have two different goals for 2030.
Correct. So we're looking at 3 different plans right now.
I'm sorry. Now I got you.
Okay, no worries. In addition to those 3 different potential plans, we're also doing a number of sensitivity runs. We're not going to necessarily formally file these with the resource data template and the CSP tool, but we're going to use them to inform specific sections of the narrative. So as I mentioned before, there's a high electrification sort of planning question in the narrative. So we'll do a model run where we have that higher load. And for reasons I'll talk about in a moment, we're also considering doing scenarios where we force in offshore wind or force in extra energy due to the Diablo Canyon extension, should that occur. All of the portfolios I'm about to show you include all of SVCE's existing portfolio, including everything that is contracted but not yet online. It has all of our PG&E allocations, including the BAMO allocation, and it also includes some additional short-term RA that we think can reasonably be procured from the market. And then finally, as I mentioned before, we are using this required IPR forecast. So before I speak too much about these results, I just wanted to really highlight that these are very preliminary. They are almost certainly going to change, but directionally, we're starting to see some trends that I wanted to bring up today. So the top green bar here shows our current portfolio. So this is how many megawatts of battery and generation we expect to have online by 2035. And beneath that, we see the results of each of the portfolios that we're looking into right now. So in general, we see a pretty significant increase in our needs for batteries. That's because the model needs additional resource adequacy. And then we also have quite a bit of new generation required to hit these RPS goals, along with our just general load growth to make sure that we're still staying at 100% clean energy. And as I'll show you in the next couple of slides, similar to the preferred system plan that the CPUC's developed, our model also tends to select a mix of solar and battery hybrids and wind. So in the 75% case, we don't have a lot of need for new resources before the late 2020s. And then we're going to start building hybrid resources and a little bit of standalone batteries. And then at the end of the planning horizon, we'll need additional wind to help balance our portfolio and meet our RPS needs. If you jump to an 100% case, the results are actually quite similar. And really all it's doing here is swapping out some of the standalone 4-hour batteries with additional hybrids to get the extra RPS energy that it requires. And then finally, if you go to a more aggressive target where you're trying to hit 100% RPS by 2030, you need new RPS energy pretty rapidly. And so it's actually selecting some in-state wind to try to achieve that goal. So I think we need to, this sort of goes to my previous comment about, is this a viable thing? Can we actually achieve this by 2030? Maybe, but something still worth considering. So those are the quick snapshots. I don't want to anchor on them too much because, as I said, they will change, but did want to give sort of a sneak peek. So as far as our next steps for analysis, we are currently going to be finalizing those conforming portfolios that we're developing using Ascend's capacity expansion tool. We're then going to take another couple sort of analytical steps to assess the portfolios. So first of all, we are going to put these portfolios into our internal resource adequacy reform tool. So the reason why we do that is the way the IRP thinks about resource adequacy and the way it's actually thought about in the RA compliance space are very different. So we want to plug our portfolios into our actual RA tool to make sure that the portfolio is useful for RA in the real world. Second of all, and this goes back to the, our exploring at scale, the 24/7, we want to calculate a carbon-free energy score for each portfolio. So that's very much akin to what we're doing with Google. And so we're not necessarily trying to hit any specific metric here, but it'll help inform whether or not the portfolio is putting us on a pathway to 24/7. And then finally, all of these portfolios will be run through the Power Sim model, which is the model we use for all of our risk analysis to calculate the costs and also see what the risk metrics for the portfolio look like. Once we have that sort of wider suite of understanding about each portfolio, we can propose a preferred system plan, because the IRP, even though you can file many plans, one of them needs to be a preferred plan. And with that, we can finalize the narrative and all of our other compliance deliverables. I want to touch briefly on sort of the key themes that we're thinking about for the narrative, because as I mentioned before, the narrative includes both discussion of the modeling and also asks different LSCs to opine on specific planning issues. And as a little bit of background, I think there's a couple of key risks happening in the IRP proceeding right now. So first of all, there's been indications from staff that they want to make the IRPs enforceable, which essentially means that if you put 125 megawatts of out-of-state wind in your portfolio in 2035, they would like to see that you actually go out and procure that. Second of all, I think it's very likely that we're going to continue to see procurement orders going forward. And so because of both of those things, I think there's some sort of defensive arguments that we might want to put into our narrative. So the first one is really to highlight that these portfolios are illustrative. They're our best guess of what we'll need 10, 15 years from now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually portfolios we will procure, because ultimately our procurement depends on the results of RFOs and what developers bid to us. And also our portfolio needs are going to change over time. And of course, we're going to adjust our needs based on our portfolio as it evolves. Second of all, I think we want to talk about issues that we've seen in the procurement track and with procurement orders in the past. Two big ones that strike me are, one, the first two procurement orders we got were based on a load share allocation, which means that the CPUC ordered 11.5 gigawatts and gave us our load share of that without any consideration of our portfolio needs. And second of all, the procurement track also had resource carve-outs last time. And what we saw was the prices for geothermal and long duration storage went up pretty significantly as soon as there was a mandate for them, which implies there might be some market power issues, or at a bare minimum, there's affordability issues for our customers when they do things like that. And then finally, we really want to highlight that our portfolio changes not just based on the bids that we get from developers, but also every time the CPUC or the legislature makes a significant policy switch, it impacts how we're going to develop our portfolio going forward. So that's part of the reason why I think there's an argument for doing this offshore wind sensitivity, to say, if you order offshore wind, our preferred portfolio would change in this way. Same with Diablo Canyon. If you extend that power plant, here's how that's going to impact our needs over the next 5 or 10 years. So with that, I'll just close by sharing our next steps with the board. So we'll be presenting during the September 14th board meeting, probably a lot of the material that you just sat through now, hopefully with an update of our results for our various portfolios that we're considering. And then on October 12th, we'll be coming to the board to seek full approval for the 2020 IRP filing, which, as I mentioned, will be due November 1st. And what we'll be seeking at that time is approval of which portfolios we would like to submit, approval of our key messages for the narrative, and then optionally, but I think it would be sort of nice to have, would be adoption of any new policy goals. So if, for instance, we do have a 75% RPS preferred case, I think it would be really valuable to be able to put into our narrative that this is now our new board goal, and we do plan to actually strive for it. And so with that, I will pause and see if there are any questions or comments or feedback.
Great. Let's see if we have any comments or feedback. And while those are coming in, let me just go ahead and say that I'm actually quite enthused by this presentation. I didn't think it was too much to manage. I thought you presented and designed it very well. And it had this strategic overarching thing that I look back on our previous discussions about strategic focus and Inflation Reduction Act. I see how all these things fit together. It's the IRA is going to be interwoven into these things as well. And so I just feel like this presentation feels board ready. And I think it's good because so often we get a project in front of us or so, or maybe we look at certain financials, but it's nice to step back and act like a board and be strategic. And you've prepared, at least me, with this kind of presentation. With that, let me see if there's any other comments from our board members. And we see Director Gibbons.
Never losing an opportunity to comment. Thank you. I agree with everything Chair just said. Very good presentation, very easy to follow, with a little bit of education on what IRP is all about and the CUP and all of that is all about. I'd like to also comment that referencing the I think your slide 18, if you go back, I think the statements that you made about the issue of enforceability, whereas the filings are illustrative, just using the what's the right word, putting into the discussion Diablo out of the blue and putting in the IRA out of the blue are both excellent examples of why it has to be illustrative and not enforceable. I mean, I think it's very simple to understand that there's so much you can't predict. And I think that those are very powerful examples of why it needs to be an illustrative, not an enforceable rule. And then if you go back to slide 13, I thought here, one of the things that I thought staff did extremely well was discussing risk and our financial risk and the whole discussion about reserves. And the way I'm understanding these scenarios are almost similar. You know, if we have to do this for the CPUC, but within our own portfolio, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this over this time period and this mix. And to me, it's just another way of understanding risk to help us evaluate what the right decisions are along the way. If I followed that, and if I'm right, I thought that was very good.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for those comments and suggestions. I don't see any other hands raised from directors, so we will go on to, let me see, I see there's an attendee. Let me see who it is. Mr. Carney, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm glad to be at the head of the line of commenters. So, Maren, thank you for your presentation. I was a modeler before I retired, and it's exciting to think about all the ways to try to make these numbers tell a story, tell a true story about the distant future, if possible. One of the questions I had is, why are the orders in terms of megawatts instead of megawatt hours, given that a megawatt of solar is not the same as a megawatt of wind or nuclear or gas? It seems perhaps stuck in the past. I'm not sure. Another question is, what is the impact of things that SVCE can't control, like the construction of new transmission to Wyoming to bring in the wind that Wyoming might generate? How do you model that? And then I had a question about wargaming with SVCE's competitor, PG&E. So the question is, do you have enough information about PG&E's status quo and their requirements for future generation to be able to determine to some degree of likelihood that the cost advantage that SVCE enjoys today is likely to persist into the future? And then a comment, not a question, which is, when you go out 12 years, the cost of things, the inflation rate, become tremendously important, and the assumptions about those really can drive everything that happens more than about 5 years out. So perhaps you could make it explicit what inflation numbers you're using and how you're modeling best case scenario, your best scenario, the one that you present, expects the cost of wind, batteries, solar, offshore wind, et cetera, to change over time. I think a visual representation of that could be informative and perhaps elicit some discussion or some insight that isn't available from the slides you've shown today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think those are all very good comments and questions. So if it's all right, I'll try to address a few, Chair Tyson.
Yes, please go ahead.
Great. I think on the generation point is one well taken. We were trying to keep the slide relatively brief. If you show generation aggregated instead of broken out by resources, the totals are going to look very similar because in each scenario, we're trying to hit the same incremental energy target. And then of course, with batteries where you aren't producing any energy, as Chair Tyson pointed out earlier, we probably would continue to show it as capacity, but all fair points. I think your point on the Wyoming wind and the transmission infrastructure is a very good one. That's actually something that they ask that we speak about in the narrative. So for each type of resource that we select, we have to speak to the risks and the potential barriers to implementation. So we will be speaking about the need for build out for additional out-of-state transmission. And it certainly is a risk in building that type of resource. I'll come to the cost issue and then come back to PG&E. On the cost issue, I think it's a very good point. We do use a price trajectory that includes inflation as well as assumptions for how those technologies will get hopefully cheaper over time due to innovation in the energy sector. I do think it's interesting that our cost trajectory actually differs from what the CPUC is using. So it's sort of interesting that we at least directionally are consistent with them. It probably speaks to the fact that hopefully across all these data points, we're getting it roughly right. And finally, on the PG&E question, so there are portions of the inputs that are known to everyone. So the CPUC has released the total load numbers that each LSE needs to achieve. But the peak forecast, the resource adequacy forecast, is confidential. So we don't know exactly what metric PG&E needs to hit there. But on the sort of competitiveness and the rate question, I think, as you pointed out, once you get 10, 12 years out, there's so many variables up in the air. It's pretty tricky to know if whether all of this is going to exactly come to fruition. And you can imagine rates swinging, a couple cents a kilowatt hour either direction. I will say that the IOUs have a more burdensome obligation to discuss rates in their IRP. So they actually have to tell the commission what they think their rates will be. And the CCAs are not obligated to do that. So probably worth spending some time sitting down and reading PG&E's IRP as soon as it's released, but hard to gain any insights on exactly what their models will select ahead of that. But all very good comments.
All right, thank you, Maren. With that, I don't see any other hands raised, so I'm ready to move on to item number 6, which is the program snapshot grid shift, EV charging.
Great. Sorry, Rebecca, I'll
Go ahead.
give you a quick little intro here. Yes, good morning, directors. Very excited to be introducing another one of these program snapshots. This is the second one that we have done. The previous one was on the EV charging incentives program. And, you know, these are intended to be short, a few minute presentations just as an info item. This one, like the previous one, is on a program that we have already launched and has been out there, but we really wanted to share with the executive committee some details on program design, some of our thinking, some things that we've observed as we've been running the program, just as an awareness piece, really, and responsive to some feedback we got from the board in the past on how else we can kind of highlight some of the work that we're doing out in the community through these programs. Joining me today is Nipur Haramath, who is our manager of the community programs team, and Rebecca Fang, who leads this program that we'll be talking about today, in addition to her day job as the data guru here at SVCE. So very excited to have this presentation, and Rebecca will be happy to answer some questions at the end. But if you find that this has merely whetted your appetite to really learn more about this program, we would love to talk your ear off and really dig into the details if you want to reach out, and we can connect at a later time. With that, I'll hand it to you, Rebecca.
Great. Thanks for that intro, Justin. Hi, everybody. Nice to be here today. I'll just jump right in. So the GridShift EV charging program is our app that helps EV drivers optimize their charging to save money on their electricity bill, as well as save emissions associated with charging. So the target audience for this program is SVCE customers who drive EVs and have access to a private home charger. Next slide, please. So a couple of key program decisions that we've made. The first is to utilize the push notification feature on the GridShift app. And we use this to call seasonal events that offer customers an opportunity to kind of engage with the app, support the grid, and also earn additional bill credits. So there's two types of seasonal events that we're currently running. The first is low carbon events to help reduce emissions beyond just the steady state optimization that already occurs. And the second is critical grid shift hours that occur during times when the grid is stressed, such as CAISO flex alerts. And these events help SVCE improve our ability to shift load during those peak hours. And then on the equity side, we're continuously integrating with different models of both EVs and smart chargers to ensure that this program is more accessible to all EV drivers in the territory. Next slide, please. So in terms of savings, users on a time of use rate that allow GridShift to optimize their charging save on average $100 per year or more. Of course, there's also emissions reductions associated with the steady state carbon optimization. There's also an additional opportunity to earn bill credits and further reduce emissions when customers participate in low carbon events and other events. In terms of participation, we're currently at 480 active users. I think that number is closer to 520 now, but we're running a couple of promotions and activities this month. Our original target was 500 by the end of this month, but I think we've already reached that, which is very exciting. One of the promotions that we're offering is a $50 sign-up bonus through the end of the month. And we've also recently released a variety of new app features in response to customer feedback that we've gotten on the app. Next slide, please. And I will wrap it up there. If you're interested in learning more, please do visit our webpage. And the GridShift app is free to download on both the Google Play and the Apple Store. So please check it out if you're interested. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. Very, very interesting presentation. And Yeah, a very good use of resource. Do we have any questions or comments from the board? Do we have any from the public? So it looks like it was a very clear presentation. Oh, we've got Director Gibbons.
I would just offer that one of my neighbors is using the program, and it's just awesome. The feedback was fantastic.
Perfect. All right, and I don't see any comments or questions from the public, so I would say thank you for that presentation and keep going, and congratulations on blowing through your first goal. And when are you shooting for 1,000?
That is to be determined. I'll definitely circle back once we get that target.
Okay, very good. All right, with that, we have finished with item number 6, and we're off to any committee or staff remarks. So I just open up the floor if any additional remarks people would like to make. Let me just say one, that I thought this is an extremely productive, really well-planned meeting, and I want to thank all of the staff for delivering that. I don't see any hands raised, and so with that, I would say we are ready to, at 11:32, adjourn this meeting. Thank you all for attending, and we'll see you next time.